The courtroom was packed on that sweltering summer morning. The weak air conditioning hummed in the background, trying unsuccessfully to ward off the heat and the tension that hung over the room. In the defendant's dock, Markeith Jameson sat with his back straight and his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't move, didn't show any impatience, nor did he look around like the other young men who usually occupied that place. To Judge Evelyn Marston, that was unusual. Normally, defendants were divided into two groups, those who trembled with fear and those who adopted a defiant attitude, as if they already knew the outcome of the hearing. But that boy seemed to be neither one nor the other. He was simply waiting. The prosecution presented its case objectively. Gerald Linton, a meticulous and methodical man, always wore impeccable grey suits and spoke in a tone that exuded conviction. He emphasized that the crime of property invasion and copper wire theft was not just an ordinary offense, but a reflection of a lack of respect for the law. "We must send a clear message," he said, casting a calculated glance at the judge. "If we don't treat these minor crimes seriously, we will be encouraging them to escalate into something much worse." On the other side, Rachel Morrow, the public defender, rolled her eyes discreetly. She had heard that rhetoric too many times. With her arms crossed, she waited her turn to speak, but her gaze lingered on Markeith. Something about his posture made her believe that there was more to this story. Rachel Morrow calmly rose, adjusting the papers on the table before speaking. Her calm demeanor hid a sharp mind and a latent frustration with the system. "Your Honor, what we have here is a case typical of wrong assumptions," she began, her voice carrying a tone of defiance. "The prosecutor wants to turn a flimsy accusation into a moral example. But where is the concrete evidence? My client was found in the warehouse, yes, but there are no recordings, no witnesses, and most importantly, there isn't an owner claiming that anything was stolen. So, I ask, what crime was exactly committed?" She cast a look at the judge, who, although maintaining a neutral expression, felt the question echo within herself. Evelyn Marston knew that, in many cases like this one, the weight of the accusation was stronger than the reality of the facts. It was the kind of judgment she almost made on autopilot, but something in that situation, or in that boy, prevented her from following that path without questioning. "Let's hear from the defendant," she decided, adjusting her glasses on her nose. "Jameson, do you admit that you were in the warehouse that night?" Markeith tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the question before answering. "Yes, Your Honor, I was there." His voice was firm, without hesitation. Linton stepped forward triumphantly. "And why exactly were you there?" "Working." Silence fell over the room. Rachel looked at him with furrowed brows, while Linton let out a dry laugh, clearly believing that the boy was lying. "Working?" he repeated in a tone of disbelief. "And what kind of work would that be exactly?" Markeith crossed his arms, maintaining the same serene expression. "I was there to see how the system works, and it worked exactly as I expected." The judge frowned, leaning slightly forward. What did that mean? But before she could ask, the courtroom door abruptly opened. All eyes turned to the entrance, where a tall man with graying hair and a penetrating gaze entered with firm steps. It was Detective Raymond Cole. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. He was not an unknown face. Cole was a legend within the police force, a veteran respected for his impeccable conduct. And at that moment, he seemed laden with urgency. "Your Honor," he said without taking his eyes off Markeith, "we need to talk, now." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Evelyn Marston evaluated the man before her. Raymond Cole was not the type to make dramatic entrances without reason. If he was there, it meant that something serious was happening. She lightly tapped her gavel to restore order. "Detective Cole, this court is in session. If you have something to say, I suggest you do so formally." Cole nodded and walked over to the prosecution table, placing a thick envelope on the counter. Here are the official documents that prove that Markeith Jameson is not an ordinary criminal. He turned to the young man, whose gaze remained unshaken. He is one of us. Prosecutor Linton laughed, a short, humorless sound. One of us? Are you insinuating that this boy is a police officer? Cole did not smile. I'm not insinuating anything, I am stating a fact. He pulled a badge from the inner pocket of his jacket and held it up. Jameson is part of a secret operation to expose systemic flaws in the treatment of black youths by the police and the judiciary. He was trained, infiltrated, and sent to document how this system responds to people like him, even when there is no concrete evidence against them. Murmurs arose again, louder this time. Judge Marston blinked several times, processing the information. The boy on the defendant's dock, whom she had almost condemned without hesitation, was an undercover officer. She looked at Markeith. He didn't seem surprised by the revelation. He didn't move, didn't smile. He just waited. The room split. Rachel Morrow looked at the young man with a mix of surprise and contained pride. Prosecutor Linton, on the other hand, appeared indignant. "That doesn't change anything," he insisted, slamming his hand on the table. "The law was still broken." Cole slowly turned to him. "And that is exactly why he was there." Judge Marston took a deep breath. She could feel all eyes on her, waiting for her reaction. But her mind was still trying to process what she had just heard. An undercover police officer infiltrated to test the very system, and the outcome exactly as he had predicted. If Raymond Cole had not entered that room, Markeith would have been convicted without anyone questioning anything. She looked at the young man again, trying to find any crack in his serenity. "Jameson," she said, her voice slower now, weighing every word. "If what Detective Cole is saying is true, why didn't you reveal your identity earlier?" Markeith tilted his head slightly, as if he had expected that question. "Because I wanted to see how far this would go. I wanted to know if there would be any hesitation, any questioning. If anyone would stop to wonder why a boy with no prior record, with no concrete evidence against him, was being treated as guilty before even defending himself." He shrugged. But no one asked. Everyone assumed. The weight of his words fell over the room. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably, while Rachel Morrow crossed her arms, her sharp gaze turning toward Marston. The silence was broken by Prosecutor Linton, who now seemed desperately clinging to what he had left. "This is absurd," he exclaimed. "This isn't an academic experiment. We are talking about the judicial system, not a psychological game." "Is that so?" Markeith asked, his calm voice contrasting with the prosecutor's barely concealed anger. "Because it seems that for some people it works like a game, and there are always those who lose before the game even begins." The room fell into a sepulchral silence. Judge Marston felt a lump in her throat. How many times had she herself presided over cases like these, blindly trusting the narrative presented? How many times had she accepted the accusations as facts without questioning if there was something behind those stories? She looked at Linton, who clenched his fists, visibly frustrated. He still wasn't ready to admit what everyone in the room was beginning to see. "Detective Cole," she said, adjusting her glasses, "how exactly did this operation work, and why was Jameson sent to this particular case?" Cole cleared his throat, aware that every word of his would carry weight. Jameson was selected for an investigation into racial disparities in the justice system. He infiltrated various situations, always within the bounds of the law, to observe how police officers and judicial authorities would react to him. The detective paused, letting the tension spread before continuing. This time, he was approached without resistance, frisked without reasonable suspicion, and arrested without concrete evidence. Everything was documented. Murmurs began again. Marston noticed that the public defender was now looking at her in a different way, as if waiting to see if the judge would accept the truth that was right before her eyes, or pretend nothing had happened. She took a deep breath. "So, are you telling me that Jameson was arrested due to a procedural error?" "No," Markeith replied. "I was arrested because I am black and I was in the wrong place. If it had been another boy, maybe he wouldn't have even been taken to the station." Marston felt the weight of those words. Markeith's response hung in the air like an invisible punch. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, others averted their eyes. But he remained impassive, as if this was not a supposition or an argument, just a fact he knew all too well. Prosecutor Linton crossed his arms, trying to regain control of the narrative. "So you are suggesting that the entire police approach, the entire judicial process, was biased solely because of your color?" His voice carried a tone of sarcasm, but also of barely concealed irritation. Markeith finally looked at him, as if only now taking the time to truly see him. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact. You can see the numbers, the reports, the statistics, but you don't need those. Just look at this courtroom now. If Raymond Cole hadn't come through that door, what would have happened to me?" The silence returned, heavier than before. Judge Marston felt the weight of the question. She knew the answer. Everyone there knew it. But admitting it was another story. Rachel Morrow couldn't help but smile slightly. For the first time in a long while, she felt that someone had managed to expose the hypocrisy of the system without mincing words. But the question was still open. What would the judge do about it? Evelyn Marston adjusted her glasses once more, an old habit when she needed time to think. "Detective Cole, the prosecution has the right to review this evidence before I make any formal decision. But I need to ask, if Jameson hadn't been arrested by mistake, would the operation still continue?" "Yes, Your Honor," Cole replied without hesitation. "The arrest wasn't planned, but what happened here was exactly what he expected to find. And that was the problem." Judge Marston closed her eyes for a brief moment. The problem wasn't just this case. It was the repetition of the same script day after day, without anyone stopping to question it. She could hear her own conscience, recalling how many young people had passed through here with similar stories, but without a veteran detective to defend them, without a badge hidden in their pocket. She looked at Linton, who was now leafing through the documents handed over by Cole, clearly trying to find a loophole, but there was none. The boy in the dock was, in fact, a police officer, not an intruder, not a thief. "Prosecutor Linton," she called, her voice firm. "In light of this new information, do you intend to proceed with the charges?" Linton hesitated. His pride didn't want to allow it, but the facts were overwhelming. He could insist, of course. He could argue that, undercover or not, Markeith had still entered the property, but that would make him seem petty, stubborn, and worse, prejudiced. He let out a short sigh and shut his folder forcefully. "The prosecution is not interested in proceeding with the case, Your Honor." It was as if the entire room exhaled at once. Rachel Morrow smiled slightly. Markeith remained serene. He already knew this would happen. But for Judge Marston, it didn't seem like an end. It felt as if something had been torn from within her. The only difference was that, this time, she did not intend to ignore it. Marcus stared at the teacher for a few seconds, trying to understand if she was really serious. The idea seemed absurd. The woman who always criticized him at school now wanted to spend extra time teaching him, and in the workshop no less. He looked at his father, expecting Robert to laugh or make some sarcastic comment, but the man only watched the scene with an evaluative gaze. Marcus scratched his neck, an old habit when he was uncomfortable. "And why would you do that?" he asked suspiciously. Miss Harrington sighed, and this time there was no authority in her voice, only something more human, almost like a silent apology. "Because I was wrong about you," she admitted, "and because you deserve a chance to show who you really are." The words caught Marcus by surprise. He expected anything but the teacher to acknowledge that she had been unfair. For a moment, he thought of refusing, not because he didn't want to learn, but because accepting it meant admitting that he needed help. And he had never been good at accepting help. But then he looked at his father, at the workshop, at the bills piled up on the counter. If he had better grades, maybe he'd have more options in the future. Maybe he could find a way to take some of the weight off Robert's shoulders. He let out a tired sigh. "Okay," he said, trying to sound indifferent. "But no nonsense, teacher." Miss Harrington smiled slightly, crossing her arms. "No nonsense, Johnson. The case is dismissed," declared Judge Marston, striking her gavel firmly. But unlike other times, she did not feel the usual relief of closing yet another case. Instead, an unease began to spread within her, like a crack that suddenly became impossible to ignore. Markeith calmly stood, straightening his posture as if he were merely fulfilling another day of work. He didn't seem relieved, happy, or indignant. He only looked directly at Marston, as if expecting something more. "And now?" he asked. The judge frowned. "Now you are free to go." Markeith nodded but did not break eye contact. "I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about the others. How many more have passed through this room without anyone questioning anything? How many more will pass?" Marston's heart pounded. He wasn't just pointing out the problem. He was asking if she would do something about it. Raymond Cole observed the scene with his arms crossed, his experienced gaze analyzing the judge's reaction. He knew what happened when someone saw the reality up close. Either you closed your eyes and pretended not to see, or you accepted that you could never ignore it again. She diverted her gaze to the papers in front of her, but the printed words now seemed empty. For the first time in years, she felt that following the protocol was not enough. Judge Marston took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Markeith's question settle in her chest. It wasn't a rhetorical question. He wanted to know what she would do about it. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't have a ready answer. Her job had always been to enforce the law, follow the guidelines, maintain order in the courtroom. But what if the order itself was wrong? She looked at Rachel Morrow, who now had her arms crossed and a provocative gleam in her eyes, as if to say, "Well, now you understand." At Linton, who kept his gaze lowered, clearly uncomfortable, at Raymond Cole, who seemed curious to see what she would do, and finally at Markeith, who simply waited, not with impatience or demand, but with the calm of someone who already knew the answer, even if it had not yet been spoken. Marston began, but stopped herself. What could she say? That she was sorry? That it would never happen again? Words wouldn't change anything, but actions could. "I will review my old cases," she finally said, surprising even herself. "The cases of young people who passed through here and were perhaps convicted without concrete evidence." The murmur in the room intensified. Rachel raised her eyebrows, clearly impressed. Cole smiled slightly. Markeith maintained his neutral expression, but something in his gaze seemed to approve of the decision. "Will that change anything?" he asked. Marston held his gaze for a long moment before answering. "Maybe it won't change the past, but it can prevent it from continuing." Markeith nodded. "Then it's a start." And for the first time that morning, the judge felt that she was doing more than merely following a script. The courtroom began to empty slowly, but the feeling of something unfinished lingered in the air. The sound of footsteps echoed on the polished floor as the spectators left, some still whispering among themselves. Prosecutor Linton left first, his expression tense, clearly bothered by how the case had unfolded. Rachel Morrow took a little longer, gathering her papers with a slight smile of satisfaction on her face. Marston remained seated, watching as Markeith and Raymond Cole exchanged a few discreet words. The young officer seemed calm, but Marston knew that the operation was not over. The investigation, the reports, the evidence, everything still needed to be analyzed. But what bothered her most was the question that remained unanswered. How many times had she been wrong before? "Are you really going to review your cases?" Cole's voice brought her out of her thoughts. He was already beside Markeith, ready to leave. She looked at him and nodded. "Yes, I cannot change what has already happened, but I can prevent it from happening again." Cole observed her for a moment and then smiled. A small, genuine smile. "Then maybe there is still hope for this system." Markeith, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "There is only hope if those in power decide to do something with it. His words resonated within Marston in a way few things ever had. She had always believed in justice, in order, in duty, but now she understood that justice was not just about enforcing the law, it was about ensuring that the law served the greater purpose of equity and not reinforcing what was already broken. As the two men walked away, she realized that that day was not the end of a case. It was the beginning of something much larger. The hours passed faster than Marston expected. The courtroom was now empty, and she remained immersed in piles of files, flipping through pages with growing tension. The evidence was all there, laid out before her like a mirror reflecting a reality she had long refused to see. Cases of young people with clean records, without any history of violence, yet still being judged with a presumption of guilt that she now recognized as wrong. She ran her hands over her face, exhausted. Each case seemed to echo Markeith's situation, and she couldn't stop asking herself how many others had been treated so unjustly as him. How could she have let it go on for all these years? It was easy to follow the routine of the courtroom. The routine gave her a sense of control, of justice, but now everything felt empty, empty of true meaning. The numbers were there, the words were written, but was true justice being served? The judge knew that many cases went unnoticed, that many decisions were made without the necessary depth, and that could no longer be ignored. When the files finally ended, she snapped the last folder shut. It felt as if she had just traversed a dark corridor, her hands bound over her eyes, and had finally removed the blindfold. She looked at the clock and realized that the day was drawing to a close. An entire day had passed since Markeith entered that room, and all that remained now was an uncomfortable silence, mixed with the feeling that something had changed permanently within her. When the last light of day went out in the courtroom, Marston stood up. She was no longer the same woman who had sat at that table hours before. Something inside her had changed, not just because of Markeith, but because of everything he represented. For the first time, she was not merely reflecting on a sentence. She was reflecting on an entire system and what she would do from that point on. She didn't yet know exactly what could change, but she knew she could no longer be a bystander, a judge who simply enforced what was imposed. The questions Markeith had asked her and the answers she still needed to find were now her mission. As she left the courtroom with the silent corridors around her, Marston felt a lightness she had never felt before. It wasn't relief, it was a different weight, something closer to a commitment. She couldn't change the past, but what happened from now on depended on her actions. If she had to be the only one to start this change, so be it. But she could no longer ignore it. Markeith Jameson had done something that no one else had managed to do. He made her see. And in doing so, he reminded her of the true purpose of her profession. Justice is not just about enforcing the law, it is about ensuring that the law serves the greater purpose of fairness and not the reinforcement of what is already failing. Yes, she thought, taking the last step on the staircase leading to the exit. Maybe things can change.